Welcome, everybody. My name is Peter Matzer. I'm the Speaker's Chair at the Association of Corporate Treasurers, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar entitled What Connectivity Conundrum? Giving Treasurers What They Thirst For, Freedom of Data. This is a follow-up webinar supported for us today by our good friends at Gresham Technologies from a previous session that was done in the International Treasury Week the ACT held back in May. Along with Bill Rest from Gresham Technologies, we're delighted to have with us today Harkus Copper from Barclays. Both Bill and Harkus will introduce themselves a little later when they come to make their first comments. Just a few words on how the technology here works, and in particular, I'd like to remind you about using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and then right at the end of the day, the survey feedback, which will help us plan additional webinars in future. The interactive widgets screen you can see in front of you there is giving you some information, and in particular as well, I'd also remind you that we'll be on Twitter at ACT Update, hashtag ACT Webinar. I may well tweet some information on this a little later on rather than live during the conversation. As I mentioned already, I'm moderating this discussion today. I'm the Speaker's Chair at the ACT, and we have with us Bill Rest, Senior Strategist from Gresham Technology, and Harkus Copper, Director, Head of Integration Information Services, Digital Banking at Barclays, and I'm delighted that both of them are with us today. Bill's going to lead us off in a moment, giving us some background to the remarks he wants to make and the discussion we're going to have later on. There will be a couple of poll questions as well during the session, so please make sure that the bar at the bottom of your screen is available to you to answer those, and we'll follow up through those as well. Clearly, as I mentioned already, we'll be taking some Q&A later on during the conversation, and right at the end, I'll close the session with one or two remarks about other events, digital events you'll be able to get from the ACT, and some information on the ACT website. So it's my pleasure to introduce Bill Rest to you, who's going to open up our remarks today. Bill.
Thanks, Peter, and good afternoon to everybody that's listening or that can see me here. As we said, my name is Bill Rest. I'm the Senior Strategist for Cash Management Solutions in Gresham Technologies. For those of you that don't know me, my background is a long-standing career in banking. I was many years in Bank of America, selling global cash management and treasury solutions to both corporates and large financial institutions. As Peter said, the title of this is giving the treasurers what they have always wanted, freedom of data, which isn't always what they've got. So we're going to try and take the lid off of that topic and talk a little bit further on it. Peter, if you can change the slide. So you'll be glad to know this is the only slide I've got, so there's no death by PowerPoint here. But I actually wanted to set the tone for some of the things that we're hoping will prompt Q&A, and obviously we'll have some polling as well. But these are really the topics that we want to focus on. So data in and data out, it's always, but probably more so than ever before, needs to be efficient, accurate, relevant, timely, and Treasury has been thrust into a strategic position of trying to protect the company. So content and the quality of that content and the immediacy of that content is absolutely key. How do treasurers make connectivity truly invisible or irrelevant? I mean, that's really the theme of this whole topic. It hasn't been irrelevant. It's something that dates back through certainly my times of selling connected treasury and cash management solutions. And what if a treasury is not using a treasury management system or a large enterprise accounting system? I mean, we'll talk a little bit about that, because clearly one size doesn't fit all, which prompts to the next point of, does size matter? And we'll try and uncover whether there's a difference between the needs of an SME or a large multinational corporate. What is the role of corporates and fintechs? That's evolving, and I think that's evolving at pace, even now under the lockdown, because things are changing, things need to change, and I'm a great advocate that doing nothing while under lockdown is probably not the right answer in terms of addressing the need for prompt reporting, security, maximum return against minimum cost, control over processing, and by that I mean total control. So, it's a time to look at those kind of addressable gaps. How do treasurers make the business case and maximize the return on investment for an ERP or TMS system? That's a massively pertinent question. As I said, my background was very much in integrating with the large ERP systems, and also I sold International Treasurer and IT2 back in the day. And working for Gresham now, I often see situations where the investment in a large TMS, perhaps more so than an ERP system, hasn't crystallized itself, and it's a good question why it hasn't. And finally on that one, is now a good time to be making change or not? Clearly, as I said before, I'm a strong advocate that it's exactly the right time to make change, and to, if Treasury is moving not even subtly but dynamically from the operational to the strategic, probably change needs to happen alongside that to bolster the proposition and ensure that the data and the proactive Treasury rather than the reactive Treasury is foremost in the proposition. Peter, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bill. Harkus, if you wouldn't mind, when you make your remarks in a moment, just briefly introducing yourself and where you sit within your organisation. The question I'd like you to perhaps draw those themes together is, are these the bones of the conversations you're having with your cash management clients at the moment, of whatever size they may happen to be?
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Bill. So, yeah, I'm Harkus Copper. I work within our digital product function at Barclays. So that's, in essence, the channels function, where all the customer-facing applications that allow clients to access their data, both in terms of submitting payment instructions to us and accessing balance and transaction reporting information, is available. And in that space, actually, a number of these questions are very, very relevant in terms of the bank's part in the exchange of that data. If you look at the efficiency question and the size question and try and combine those in particular, it doesn't necessarily mean that any given organisation or treasury function has to do the integration in a particular way. And what's happened in terms of COVID-19 and the way the world has developed, not least of which through the introduction of things like open banking, is that conversation feels like it's becoming a little bit more complicated, but broadly speaking, it's the same question. What we are talking about in reality here, and forgiving, obviously thinking very much about the potential audience here, and obviously people will have a range of knowledge and abilities. So I'm going to take it back a little bit and in essence concentrate on data and what that means, and those two key themes I alluded to just now. And that's really the customer ability to, through their treasury function, instruct the payments they need to make in order to pay suppliers, expenses, payroll, whatever, but also reconcile the accounts receivables and payments received in and manage their cash more broadly. So the bank applications really follow kind of three key themes. There's the online and mobile types of channels, and they have very much the advantage that interplay of data is in essence near real time. The user sits in front of a graphical user interface and can access the things they want to access there and then. But the key word there is there's a user in play. So it's not terribly efficient in all cases, because then to interplay the data with the back office applications that the treasurer may be running, whether that's an Excel spreadsheet, a TMS, or a full-blown ERP, means that user has to go in, extract information, bring it out of that application, and then plug it into those other applications. So the alternatives up until now have very much been in the host-to-host and Swift space. They have the advantage of that data play being much more integrated. You can automatically exchange the data via secure transfer protocols like SFTP or Swift File Act, or even EBIX for France and Germany. But they tend to be quite heavy lifting in terms of capability. So the conversation more recently has started to move towards APIs, and maybe that's something we can talk about a little bit later on, around more efficient methodologies by which that data can be exchanged. But I think that comes to part of the questions on the screen as well, is how much is that visibility relevant to the treasurer? At the end of the day, you just want the thing to work. You just want the balance and transaction information to be in the place you need it for the application, whatever that may be you've employed to do that job, to automatically do as much of that processing as it can. And you want the application that prepares your payment instructions to automatically, within obviously good governance and the right security and making sure that those transactions have been approved at the right levels in the organisation, but to then automatically be sent to the bank for payment so the beneficiary receive those funds in the most expeditious fashion. So there are many, many themes around the customer, the treasurer's chosen application in the back office, even if that is something as simple as a spreadsheet, but certainly right up to that being a full ERP. And again, that would depend on whether or not you're an SME or a large multinational corporate, but how that interfaces more efficiently with your bank and your ability to manage the accounts with that bank for the purposes of, as I say, those three key themes: making payments, viewing balance and transaction information for reconciliation purposes, and then managing your cash by ensuring it's in the right place for you. So I'll pause there because I kind of, to your original question, tried to bring in the various points that are on the slide right there, but I've not focused in on any one of them. So really, where do you want to take the conversation next in terms of maybe creating some of that focus?
Thank you, Harkus. There's some very interesting points you've made there. We've already got a couple of questions coming in on Q&A, and I'll pick up one or two of them in a moment. What I want to do is take the audience to our first poll question, just to see where, if you like, their priorities are lying. So hopefully everyone out there listening to us at the moment will have access to the poll question. You'll be able to put your answer in and submit that, and we'll see the answers to that very briefly. I think that will give us some pointers, but the question, perhaps, Bill, I'd put back to you first while we're waiting for those to come in, and I'll move on to that slide in a moment. Harkus raised the point there that perhaps the size doesn't matter. You raised the point already, depending on what technology you've got. But we have to assume, or we know, that everybody is at a different particular point. If someone comes to you and says, well, okay, here I am now, what are the 2 or 3 key things I need to be worrying about, either to make this system work more effectively for me, to get better information? What sort of pointers might you give to someone? Again, let's just assume for the sake of an argument that the organizations, they're all the same size, whether they're large or small. But there must be some pointers, perhaps, that you can say to people, you need to think about this thing and this thing and this thing.
Yeah, so Harkus made some interesting points, and I can break them down, or I'll try to. The first one, I mean, he looked over his shoulder historically, and Peter, I'm a great one for looking at things like that. So the way this developed in the past is that enterprise accounting systems, treasury management systems, and the banks were very good at selling their solution and software. And it was fashionable at the time to have a proprietary file interface because it was a lock-in. It made it very, very difficult to move from one bank or one vendor to another vendor. So that's probably the way that all of this evolved. In terms of your point, Peter, about the relevancy of things, the first one for me is the visibility of the banking information. And I think that, as I said before, that's problematical, and it's been heightened as a consequence of the lockdown. I noticed that liquidity is coming up quite prominently, and it would do. If I have 10, 20, 50, 100, or 100 plus banks going through the whole does size matter spectrum, I need to be able to see all of my banks. I need to see all of that information. I need to see all of them consolidated, so not necessarily in an array of disparate systems. And I preferably would like to see it as instant or as real time as possible to be able to manage it.
There's a question that's just... Sorry to interrupt the section, Bill, and we're looking there at the poll results, but there is a question that's popped up about the impact of API and open banking, and I think you were just beginning to allude to that. Do you want to take that just a touch further, if you would, please? Yeah,
I can. So I'm very simplistic about how I see that working. I mean, open banking, and Harkus may choose to shoot me down, but open banking at the moment is ostensibly a retail play. It hasn't really factored itself to be totally relevant within the corporate space at the moment. API to me is about being, if I'm going to connect with somebody and I want API capability, I want my data and I want to be able to retrieve it, not have it pushed. And I want to retrieve it when I want it. And this comes back to that kind of instancy point of view. And I want it in the way I want it, not just the file format, but the content as well. So I guess what I'm also saying there is I don't want it pushed to me via API at the end of the day in an MT940, because all you've got there is a future iteration of today's or yesterday's problem. So yes, it's the way forward. It's absolutely the way to go. I'd also say that be wary of looking at open banking and API as an absolute panacea, because whilst there is the desire to standardize, there's a desire to standardize at a base or a consistent base level. Thereafter, a lot of it may well remain different. So again, depending on the data, the services that you're retrieving, if that's in a multi-bank environment, it may or may not be as clear as you would like it to be just because it's API driven. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bill. Harkers, I'll bring you back in. Maybe just briefly before you comment on what Bill's just said. Do the poll results there surprise you at all from the conversations you're having with your customers?
No, I mean, it's interesting that there's a fair split between liquidity and forecasting. That's exactly where I'd expect. Mm-hmm. But that cash management comes a little lower against the two. But again, not unusual, I would have thought, because I see, in essence, forecasting and liquidity management being an extension of cash management in that context.
Totally.
Risk and control. I suppose, in the way the question has been asked, was likely to come lower, but I'm absolutely convinced, of course, that all participants joining today are very aware of risk and very concerned to ensure that their environments are secure from a fraud perspective, anti-malware preparation and all that stuff. So I don't doubt that the question's been answered in a subtly different way. Risk and control clearly is top of mind in most cases in terms of the interactions regarding the exchange of data, but in terms of the importance of the data itself, then yeah, liquidity and forecasting clearly are always going to be the lead in that regard.
And where do you sit on Bill's points on the sort of API open banking debate?
Well, it's quite interesting. I kind of want to link that back to the point I made around the invisibility from the customer's point of view of the connectivity question. I think if we bring it back to its basics, there's always, with regard to the exchange of data, there's always two questions to ask. What format do you want it in, or what format are you going to send it in, and what method are you going to employ to exchange it? So formatting is very interesting. Swift have been the most prevalent player in that space for many, many years, and many systems obviously use the Swift format. So the term MT940, Bill dropped in there, will be a term hopefully for most of the audience that they'll recognise. And a Swift MT940 is obviously an end-of-day, in essence, statement. It's a full data dump of your opening balance, partial transactions, and your closing balance. But as the world evolves, and you look to open banking and APIs don't use the Swift formatting. Of course they don't. They use a different standard entirely, and without getting too technical, they're largely based on an ISO 20022 standard, which is an XML standard. Now, interestingly, that also under another program of work, which is often known as the PCIR program, which is where the industry as a whole, not just the UK, but many, many global geographies as well, and Swift themselves, are beginning to migrate away from a number of proprietary, legacy, Swift-based, older-based formats to that single ISO 20022 XML standard as the way forward. So perhaps the question of standard or format in time will become less cumbersome than it is today. You'll perhaps stop having to ask, what is your system capable of reading, and more understand what is your system capable of doing once it's got the data. So right now that question is almost too important. You have to be able to deal with the format first before you can then deal with what the content is. And then similarly from a delivery perspective, you have to ask the question, how am I best able to receive this data? Am I going to log in to an online channel and pull it down for myself? And for many, that's relatively efficient. That's not a problem at all. And certainly all of the banks have online systems that are very well geared to doing that for you. But when that is lots and lots of data, lots of times during a day, if it only takes you 2 minutes to do it once, that's fine. But if you're doing that 30 or 40 times a day, that's an awful long chunk of your day taken out just getting the data again before you even do with it what you want. So that's why I think API becomes subtly different to the question we had in the past around maybe using either Swift or a host-to-host, because what open banking has done, and that's a different conversation entirely, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but to at least to allude to it, is the whole of the open banking infrastructure in the UK at least is predicated upon APIs, application programming interfaces, and that ISO 20022 format as the baseline content format. So it's accelerated the question around how might APIs be used in the exchange of data in a direct-to-client capacity as well as through open banking. Now, just to stay on the theme of open banking briefly as well, if you look at the existing channels, obviously, as I mentioned before, the customer can use the online channels, the host-to-host channel, the Swift channel, the API channel from the banks. What open banking does is it introduces another channel, if you like, through a chosen partner. So you can go to a third-party provider who is formally recognised by the regulator as an account information service provider or a payment initiation service provider or both, and they then have full access to all the banks through the open banking APIs to interface on your behalf in calling the data. Now, Bill made the point that that's very much a retail play right now, and I largely agree with that, but that's not to say that it's not there for corporates. It absolutely is. It went live in September of last year. But perhaps the reason it has yet to take off in the corporate mindset is it still relies on the corporate treasurer or user accessing and approving the third party's use of that data via the online channel. So whilst the third party will call for the data through the API, the user has to consent to that using the bank's online channel, and that's okay in the balance and transaction reporting space because that's a once in every 90 days consent. But for payments, it's for every single payment. So it looks very similar to using the online channel anyway. So there's some development to be done there in that space to make it appeal, I think, to corporates more than it does already for the retail customer base. So I don't want to spend too much time on open banking, but hopefully that brings the point together. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, there's a couple of questions come in about the rigidity of systems, about whether you go back and buy whole packages or whether you buy things that integrate and bring things together with sort of on the API front. But I'm just wondering, Bill, one of the points you raised, as I've got there on the slide, and your key themes about the role of corporates and fintechs, who, in your opinion, is responsible for, how do I want to put this, bringing consistent language together, what I want as a corporate, what you can provide, and what Harcus can provide from your different perspectives. It seems to me that a lot of the debate about technology is really actually about just understanding what I want to achieve as a corporate, as a service provider, and as a financial institution. Do you think that we're any closer to resolving that?
No, I don't. I mean, I hear what Harcus says, and I totally agree with him. Open banking and API, they're noble concepts, and ultimately they will hopefully be something that can be taken forward and address some of the problems that exist today. I talk to a lot of banks. I talk to a lot of treasuries. Treasuries in particular, one of the commonest things that I hear is, I want to press a button right now at this time of day, and I want to be able to see my global position, and I want to be able to interrogate that global position across all banks, across all subsidiaries, across all currencies. And often, irrespective of having a TMS system, that's problematical, both in terms of the timeliness to achieve that. And as Harcus alluded to, it may be that that's coming from a variety of different systems, and therefore there's an integration and connectivity consideration to it. Those kind of simple, fundamental, and they are fundamental, of being able to fix and integrate the treasury position. I mean, at the moment, it is so imperative. Liquidity came top, and Harkus made a really valid point that cash management, of course, underscores that. And I saw the view on risk, but it depends on what we call risk. There's operational risk, treasury risk, systemic risk. I mean, there are many, many versions of risk, but the risk, the heightened risk at the moment is the risk of missing out on liquidity options because I can't see my global position. Or if I do get to see it, it's too late in the day to do something about it. Or I want to minimize exposure, and I'm long in half of my accounts, but I'm short somewhere else because I couldn't see them. Or I can't minimize intraday drawdowns because I can't see my positions in a real-time enough environment. And similarly, on the payments side of things, again, Harkus talked about API and SWIFT and some of the initiatives around payments, but there's a reality check here as well that, host to host it's a large pipe, it's a connectivity consideration, it's often a proprietary file format, it's usually batch format coming from the source payment system, and even if it wasn't, the likelihood, because of the mismatch between where everybody is at the moment, is that once it gets behind the walls in a bank, even if it was real-time transactions that were sent across, they may well get batch processed again. So there's a lot of issues around the integration, the use of data, the reconciliation of the data, and the timeliness of it all, and the ability to see the liquidity position and actively manage it. And I'm a firm believer, and I might not have been at one time, but I'm a firm believer that this is between banking and fintech collaboration to be able to put a solution forward that is optimal for the corporate right now, rather than waiting for different initiatives to evolve. And I'll stop at that.
Just before I go on to the next poll question, a couple of questions have come up about whether there is, or you would envisage, a viable alternative to SWIFT. And in my limited understanding of the technology here, would API stroke open banking lead us towards that, or does that lead us more towards SWIFT, or are the two divergent in different ways? Perhaps, Harkus, maybe you care to comment on that.
Yeah, I think the importance there is not to think of it as one replacing another. Each have their own merits based on the customer needs. So SWIFT, obviously, as a functionality in the connectivity and data space, is very well played toward those customers that are multi-banked, particularly in multiple geographies, because you're creating connectivity through a trusted security layer that the banks have been using for 40 years, using methodology that's been around for as long, but is equally developing, as I said, about the migration to ISO 20022, away from the SWIFT proprietary MT format as well over time. That most systems, most treasury management systems, most enterprise resource planning applications understand and know and love today already. And the advantage is you're doing that through in essence, one pipe. With an API-based solution, that equally has a part to play, but the risk in the early phases is that one of standardization. Right now, every bank will be developing their customer-facing API propositions and trying to do so cognizant of ensuring a standard. And in the UK, probably the open banking standard is the best proxy for that. And there are other entities like the Berlin Group across Europe that are looking at the way of standardizing that for now. But the risk is that each bank develops the API in a subtly different way, and the corporate is connecting to each bank's APIs, having to make adjustments for those subtle differences. So SWIFT is kind of ubiquitous for the multi-bank client. API is easier, lighter, possibly even ultimately cheaper to implement. All that, I mean, make a comment here. A lot of people think API is a new thing. APIs have been around since the 50s. It's just they come out every now and again as the shiny new tool, and that's kind of what's happened. As I said before, open banking has accelerated the conversation around APIs because the entire open banking infrastructure is built on APIs. But what they certainly offer here is a lighter touch potential in terms of integration with the customer's chosen back office system. And let's not forget, coming back to the original point that Bill made, it comes to that very idea of what is it that I'm going to use this data for? So once I've solved the question of what format do I want it in and how am I going to collect it, I'm asking those questions in the context of what I'm going to plug it into. Is it going to be an Excel spreadsheet? Is it going to be a treasury management system? Or is it going to be an ERP system? So the question, as much as anything, is what can those systems cope with? Can I easily interface an API with my chosen TMS provider? If not, do I need a third party to help solve that element for me as well? What does that look like? Is it easier for me to do it that way than do it via Swift or via a host-to-host, or should I just carry on using an online channel and extract it for myself? These questions, there's no one answer to. It will depend on the complexity of the customer, the application they've chosen in the back office, and their willingness in terms of what is ultimately going to be technology spend and investment. So one of the other questions that Bill touched on in his introduction as well was leveraging, therefore, the return on investment on the ERP. And certainly if you've got all the way up to the level of investing in an ERP, you absolutely want to be spending the money of finishing the job properly and connecting automatically to the data. You don't want a person there, sat in front of that ERP manually bringing data in and out, because you spent all that money on a Rolls Royce in essence, and you're still putting cheap tyres on it. I mean, it's a really poor analogy, but you're not getting the full advantage of the investment you've made if you still have people interfacing with it rather than automating it end to end. Now, at the bottom, at the lower end of the scale, if you're running it off an Excel spreadsheet, then it's probably going to cost you too much more than you have available in your budget to interface, and a person doing that might be the most efficient way of doing it. So one size certainly does not fit all.
Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. I just want to bring the second poll question in for the audience, and here we're talking about managing secure connectivity between the Treasury and its banks is the primary responsibility of, and we're going to find out what people think of some of their colleagues, unless some of their colleagues are to give us the answer as to what they think of them. While we're waiting for the audience to answer that question, Bill, just a brief comment, if you would. When you're talking to corporate clients who come and talk to you, is there anything in their conversation that says our financial institutions, our financial service providers, want us to produce information in this way in terms of their credit position or their risk management positions? Are we slightly at danger here of missing a bigger picture here, which is this is a tool to help corporates deal with their financial positions and their financial health? It's not solely about the process.
No, I don't think it is, although the problem has been exacerbated around the process for a long, long time. I was just thinking while Harkus was talking, it is about, if I was sitting there as a practitioner of Treasury, and I'm not, but I see the problem and I see the frustrations, I would want, Harkus talked about the return from the systems. I want enterprise-wide accounting connectivity, and who does that is kind of like the perennial question. I could go to my banks and say, you need to help me with this, but do they divert precious project and product resources to do this? Does Treasury have enough heavy lifting gear of its own to maintain different file formats? And even to Harkus's point, Swift is ubiquitous, and I get that. It's a highway on which all of the payments and the information flows, but be mindful of the fact I mentioned the good old MT940 earlier, which is end-of-day reporting. We bring that back for many, many corporate treasurers, and we bring it back into a consolidated portal for information purposes. We see over 70 different variations of exactly the same message. So, if you look at that over the 40-year tenure of Swift being in the financial services sector like that, back to another point of Harkus is there, would you then put a bet on API that everybody will build it consistently? I probably wouldn't.
I just want to move on now. Thank you for that. Move on now. Let's have a look at the poll results here. It is a little bit as I might have suspected. It's not me, Gov, I think might be the answer there to an extent. My IT colleagues, well, that assumes you're in an organisation that has them, is the largest share. My Treasury system provider, and I'll come back to that in a minute, my bank, and then a specialist third-party provider, for which we might read, I couldn't possibly name one that off the top of my head. Just a quick question, though, and this is to both of you. Questions come in, though, that talks about Is there a marketplace here that's going to move away from banks as the primary providers of this type of information? It was this question I was really trying to get at. Corporates still need banks for credit, for financial services, and a variety of other things. But do they need them for information transmission, or are corporates going to be able to choose between different providers much more so than they might have done to date? Harkus, do you have a view on that?
I do, and I don't want to sound like sort of arrogant banker here. So I'm going to try and carefully phrase it in such a way that you're absolutely right. In terms of the need for the bank account and access to liquidity and finance, then obviously that's the bread and butter. And data is extremely important. And of course, what we're really talking about is data that reflects activity over those accounts. And certainly for accounts receivables and reconciliation, there is an absolute need to receive that data. For forecasting, there's an absolute need to receive that data. For liquidity management, there's an absolute need to know what accounts have funds on them, what accounts are overdrawn, etc. So the bank is very much still relevant in operating, maintaining, holding the accounts and the balances and the transactions that go over them. And the bank is still very much relevant in ensuring that the client has access to all of the data that reflects those positions and those movements and enables that reconciliation. What is right and proper is that the customer has a choice as to how they access that information. And I don't think, therefore, it's a question of one replacing the other. It's a question of ensuring that the right choice is there. And coming back to open banking, I mean, one of the very reasons for open banking was to open up competition in giving customers that choice. And that's absolutely the right approach. And that ensures then that the customer can pick solutions that best meet their needs. And sometimes that will be the bank's online channel. Sometimes that will be an open banking provider who will call the data via the open banking APIs. Sometimes that will be interfacing directly to the bank's own API. Sometimes that will be Swift. Choice is key here. Trying to dictate to the customer how it should be done is absolutely the wrong way and would certainly be anti-competitive. So all of these things are complementary. I don't think it is a question of one ultimately replacing the other or disenfranchising another. The bank has a part to play, and a very important part, in ensuring the customer has access to accounting facilities, and in so providing those accounting facilities have access to data that goes over those accounts.
Bill, a thought occurs to me when listening to that, and I take Harkus's point, and it's still really important. And again, depending on the size of your organisation and what your needs are from a financing point of view, and so on, that banks provide. We've had one or two questions as well about some aspects of risk, so foreign exchange management and those types of issues. Are we in danger here of slightly missing the point that getting hung up on the technology or the way in which this information is produced isn't the same as what do you want to do with it? How is it going to really affect the financial health of your organization? In the conversations you have with clients and potential clients, does your experience, do you have to steer them towards that direction? Do they come to you with that direction? I mean, I'm perhaps asking you to step away from your immediate role, but give us a benefit of that experience that you have.
I think it's about no two are the same. So it's about understanding the problems and then seeing from a technological point of view how those problems or gaps can be fixed. I found myself agreeing quite a lot with what Harkus said there. And in terms of a bank administering its bank accounts and its client relationship, 100% agree. And for that, they will have their own bank portals, and that's not going to change. That being said, if I'm multi-banked, and that can be a few banks or it can be many, many banks, there is a rigidity of the way the information is portrayed and displayed, certainly from a cash management point of view in traditional banking portals. If emerging practices, suppliers and technology are quickly evolving in the marketplace that can not only integrate with the treasurer's external world or in terms of enterprise integration, but can display that data across all of the banks in a way that it can then be proactively managed, then the banks shouldn't care. And I don't mean that's in the sense that they don't care, because they obviously do. But from a relationship point of view, they still see their balances. They still see their transaction volume. They still have the relationship. What they're relinquishing to a large degree is their data in the broader and more complex data picture. A good example, and it was uppermost in the poll, was liquidity. There are a number of banks out there with sophisticated liquidity models that are available to the clients, but they will typically work very well within the walls and the account structure of the bank that has that product. So if you're, as I said, multi-banked and have banks outside of that, then that's somewhat fractured. And there is technology and people out there now that would be able to address those gaps, and that will minimize risk, potentially reduce costs, and will optimize the position that I think a treasurer, as we said at the start, wants and demands.
We're coming towards the end of the session, which is a shame, really, because it's a fascinating conversation, as it was when we did this originally back in May. Just for the audience, I'm going to be putting up one or two slides about one or two ways in which they can further engage with the ACT and get more information on all matters of corporate treasury. But I just wanted to pick up with both you, Bill, and with Harkus on one or two final remarks. Somebody who's sitting there thinking, well, where do I go next? Is there a couple of things you'd say that really you think should be front and center for them? Harkus?
I think always return to the kind of the few basic questions. One, if you've invested in a system already, then some of these questions can answer themselves to a degree. If you haven't invested in a system, you need to think about maybe a broader set of questions. But literally, what format can I exchange data in? Am I able to exchange data in? And that's both from the ability of your system in reading that format and the ability of the bank accepting and sending formats. What pipe am I going to exchange that data over? Am I going to do that through an internet online channel? Am I going to do it over a secure file connection over a host to host? Am I going to use an API or Swift? And how am I going to use it? What system am I trying to interface to in order to make best use of that data? If you're asking those key questions, then you can pose them to your various partners in that regard, the treasury management supplier, the ERP provider, any other vendor in that space, and particularly your bank, and seek out the person in the bank that is a cash management specialist, that whose role it is to talk to you about these types of propositions, either within a cash management function or a product function, to look at various opportunities that are available to you, and look at them as choices and choose the one that best meets your needs.
Bill, do you have one or two closing comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I agree with Harkus, but having looked at that and then looked at who my banks are and the connectivity choices that I have to make, and then looking at my enterprise environment and the outputs that I have there, I may well have a lot of those linkages or legacy linkages already in place. My comment would be that connectivity piece is all well and good. I would encourage, particularly right now, to look at my treasury environment, and it comes back to that point where they're focusing on liquidity and risk, etc. What keeps you awake at night? What are the gaps in what you're doing at the moment? Is it in terms of foreign exchange risk, reconciliation, being able to see the whole liquidity position across all of my banks? How proactively and quickly can I react to an intraday treasury position that I need to do something about? Because those are things that could be fixed and could be fixed quickly. And rather than waiting for, API or open banking or any of the noble initiatives we talked about, is it the time to wait for all those things to happen? Or from a treasury point of view, can I make them happen and future-proof myself at the same time?
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you very much, Harkus, as well. Thank you very much to everybody who's been listening and participating in the Q&A today. Please do stay for a few minutes if you're logged on and provide your feedback to the ACT. That's extremely useful to us. Please do keep your eye on treasures.org for upcoming digital events with the ACT. But with that, I'd like to thank Harkus. I'd like to thank Bill. I'd like to thank everybody listening. I'd like to bid everybody a good day. Thank you very much.